Hello. Hi, everyone. How is everyone doing? So, I am Dr. Lisa Norton. I'm the Dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences, and I want to welcome you all for being here as part of our social justice series. I know the students, this is a class for our students. So, this is the fourth of the series so far, and this is our fifth annual year. So, it's a really important year for us as part of the social justice series. I want to let you know I'm dressed a little casually today because it is Physician. So our PA students are actually in the only joint program in the country with public health. So they receive both a PA and a public health degree within 3 years. It's a very accelerated format, and they work really hard. So I want to recognize them during PA week. And appreciate the design on the back of the shirts is actually from the students. They designed a Mare Island actual scene in the back, which is amazing. So want to recognize that. Real quickly, I just want to welcome you and let you know that as a Toro University, we are so excited to have speakers here today to address climate studies and climate justice and environmental justice. So we have varying opinions that are expressed during our social justice series. And so we encourage active dialogue. TUC as a university takes a pretty objective stand on some of the items that come up, but we do, so not all opinions expressed are opinions of the administration as a whole, but I do say that we are very much advocates of public health, social justice, so that's why we actually have this series. I also want to welcome you all to, my husband's going to be by in just a little bit. I have some cards. If you would like to actually donate to our social justice fellowships, we actually have students. Are there any students in the room, social justice fellows? Okay, yay, raise your hands. I know I do this to you every time. But community members who are here, if you'd like to donate to our social justice fellows, we do have some pledge cards, and we encourage you to do that. They actually help us put together the programming and some of the interviews and panels and the work that goes behind the social justice and issues we do throughout the year. So I encourage you to contribute to that. So without further ado, I'm going to let us start our program, and thank you all again for being here. We do have a reception tonight as well, but I'll let Dr. Wilson, Deirdre Wilson, come up and talk a little bit more about that.
Welcome again. I am really excited about this evening's presentation. We have a dynamic speaker and a woman tremendously involved in social justice and most recently climate justice. We're going to begin our presentation. Please come up forward and we'll try to work this out with. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ms. Patterson while we work out our IT issues. So as you all know, this is our fourth session in our fifth year for the Social Justice Speaker Series. We have evolved as the years have gone by, and we hope to continue this year after year. This is quite a timely session this particular semester. We have lots of climate issues, and Ms. Patterson herself has experienced one of the problems we have here in California with local fires. She actually braved her way through a fire that was in American Canyon. She didn't have to actually go through the fire, but had to experience the smoke and things that accompanied all the small fires that we've had. So Ms. Patterson is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program and has served as coordinator and co-founder of the Women of Color United. Ms. Patterson has worked as a researcher, program coordinator, manager, advocate, and activist on women's rights, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental and climate justice. She also served as a senior women's rights policy analyst for ActionAid and also the president of the HIV/AIDS program for IMA World Health, and also served as the Outreach Project Associate for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and research coordinator for Johns Hopkins University. She has served also on many boards and committees as well. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. If you could all help me in welcoming Ms. Patterson.
All right. So good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. We're going to try to get this going here, and I'll cue it up, I guess. Once we get this playing, the name of this clip is called "In the Air," and it's taking place in Baytown, Texas. A spoken word artist is really telling the story of the impacts of environmental injustice in this community. Baytown, Texas is on the front lines of kind of the petrochemical corridor, and they are also a place that experiences a lot of the disasters that we're seeing, including being impacted by Hurricane Harvey and most recently by Imelda. So they are not only experiencing the frontline pollution, but they're also experiencing the other side of the climate continuum in terms of the increase in extreme weather. So let's see if this works for us. Okay, well, we're gonna get the sound going, and then, or maybe I can hear it vaguely. Okay, maybe not. But maybe I'll just kind of give you a sense of what the rest of the presentation will be, so you have a bit of an understanding of what we'll be talking about. So I'm going to be talking a bit about kind of the ways that communities of color and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by exposure to pollution and so forth, about the ways that our political and economic system are set up to perpetuate the cheap means of production, and how communities of color and low-income communities bear the brunt of those impacts, and we all do at the same time. And then I'll talk a little bit about the disproportionate vulnerabilities to impacts of climate change for communities. And then I'll once we're kind of properly depressed, I'll switch over into talking about the just transition solutions that are happening around the country, and the ways that we can actually turn around the system to get us to where we need to be. But hopefully, if we end up with not being able to do the sound, then I can just kind of roll through without it. But I don't want to. Let's see. So I guess one question I have is: are most people here from California, or are people from different places? Yeah, who's from California in the room? Oh, okay, yes, wow, okay, well, that's good to know. And where are other people from who aren't from California? If you could just shout it out. New York, okay. Pardon? Virginia, thank you. Minnesota, thank you. Where else? Georgia, thank you. My brother lives in Georgia, Covington. I spent a lot of time in Minnesota as well, and New York, because so much happens there. Is everyone from the United States? Is there anyone from outside of the United States? No? Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the international relationships between how the U.S. is such a small part of the population, but creates so much of the pollution that drives climate change, and how we have climate forced migration as a result. But let's see. So in the meantime, pardon? Okay, so in the meantime, I'll give you a sense of where I'm from. I was born and raised in Chicago. My dad came to the United States from Jamaica, and he met my mom, who's from Mississippi. She came up to Chicago. Many people, if you don't know, who are African American, come up to northern United States from Mississippi to Chicago in particular. That was a big kind of route during the days when there was this migration north. And so my mom came from this small place called Dublin, Mississippi, that only had, in terms of any kind of commercial, well, the only thing that it's known for is actually having a post office. Otherwise, there's no stores there. There's certainly no street lights or anything. It's a very, very small town. I got to visit it when I was going through Mississippi when there were these floods and tornadoes back in 2011. And to visit my mom's hometown in that context was very interesting because there were so many places that were heavily impacted by the flooding and the tornadoes there. So we were driving up and down the Black Belt, really literally rescuing people who hadn't been found by FEMA or the Red Cross or otherwise. There was one woman we visited in this place called Yazoo City in Mississippi who she was medically blind, and she could see, but she was technically blind, and she had her truck that was only went, let's see, it wouldn't go in reverse. So there were a lot of issues there, and then we were trying to get her to get out, but she wouldn't leave because she said that she had this freezer that was full of meat, and she refused to leave this freezer full of meat. So we had to figure out how we were going to get the freezer full of meat out when she had this truck that didn't go in reverse, and there was a lot of complications. But in the end, it was really kind of a lesson in really having to meet people where they are in terms of their values, because she literally was prepared to stay there while the floodwaters were rising because she didn't want to leave what the only thing that she felt like she had of value, really, in terms of this freezer that had all of this meat. And so that was an education for all of us. Because I like to kind of start with the voices of communities that are speaking for themselves. One of the principles of what we call democratic organizing is letting people speak for themselves. So I'll stand here and I'll tell you a number of the stories that really illustrate the inequities that make this work so important, but it's also important to be able to have people to tell their own stories. And so that's why I really like to start with the Baytown, Texas, where people are literally telling the stories of the impacts that they're experiencing themselves. But hopefully we'll be able to get back to that. But in the meantime, I will go from here. Oh, good. So the way that we talk about this work, we start with kind of a vision when we're working with communities in terms of what they consider to be the beloved community. What are their ideal circumstances that they want for their communities? What are the threats to those ideal circumstances? And what are the assets that they have in their communities? And what do they see as what they want, not just kind of to survive, but to actually thrive as community members? Okay, sure. Thank you. I don't know. So does this come out or because? Thank you. Okay, it's just charging. Okay, good. So when we talk about when we begin to talk about what the vision, people often talk about the basics in terms of the commons that everyone should have access to: clean air, clean water, food, shelter, energy, et cetera, et cetera. And then we talk about where we are, where we have this economy that's built on commoditization of natural resources and human resources. We have this quote from Martin Luther King: "I never tend to adjust myself to economic conditions that take basic or necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few." And that's the situation we find ourselves in now with our economic and political systems. We have this historical context, as we said, of rampant extraction and reckless extraction of natural resources and of humans. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, this being the 400th anniversary of people being taken from their lands, and other ways that not only enslavement, but also since then the ways that labor has been commoditized, and where people are not necessarily, where their human rights and certainly their labor rights are not being honored. And then we find this kind of institutionalized in our trade policies, our manufacturing policies, our financial policies, and so forth and so on. And so, and with that, we see this violation of rights based on economics, based on country of origin, based on race, based on gender and education, and so forth and so on. And so these are just to remind us of what our actual human rights are. And because often in the United States we talk about civil rights, but there isn't necessarily a reference to human rights, although that's increasing. And so, again, from Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So when we talk about the commons and whose health and well-being ends up being sacrificed, and so that there are luxuries for the few, we know that that Flint is a standing example of where a community was being used for the economic well-being, or the economic opportunities in the community. So we had industry there that was there doing manufacturing. Meanwhile, they're polluting the water with no holds barred because of our lack of regulations. And then once it was more financially lucrative for them to leave and do manufacturing overseas or otherwise, then they literally pulled up stakes and ripped out the economic engine of Flint, Michigan. And so we had the loss of 85,000 jobs, and therefore the community didn't have the wherewithal to really maintain its finances. And so we had this financial degradation, which then left the community vulnerable, or the city vulnerable, for financial, what they call emergency financial management, which was a law that was imposed where the city council and the mayor were pushed to the side, and they imposed a governance structure of emergency financial manager whose only mandate was to balance the books. And this is where you saw the Flint River not becoming the source of water, the highly contaminated Flint River becoming the source of the water. So the history of underregulated pollution, then disinvestment, and then displaced democracy are all kind of led to where Flint is or became in terms of the toxic water systems. And we see that happening more often than not. When we talk about our energy systems, we put out a report last year called Fumes Across the Fence Line, the health impacts of air pollution from the oil and gas facilities on African American communities, where we found that oil and gas facilities were more likely to be placed next to African American communities as well as Latino communities, and that these communities were bearing the impact of the exposure. This is one such community, largely a Latino community, but also African American, called in Houston, Texas, where there aren't really laws around where things can be sited, and whether it's, these industrial facilities can be sited right next to a home or a school. So Cesar Chavez High School is right next to this oil refinery, and that's one of 5 oil refineries within a 10-mile radius of the school. And you see what's coming out of those smokestacks. And those kids are breathing down the pollution from these smokestacks. And unfortunately, this is the norm in many communities across the country, where we have this disproportionate impact of the exposure to these toxins. And we all know about the BP oil drilling disaster that happened some years ago that not only took lives, but also livelihoods. And the Gulf still hasn't fully recovered from the impacts of the BP oil drilling disaster. We put out a report a few years ago. We're about to put out a second one called Cold-Blooded: Putting Profits Before People. And in that report, we found that African Americans, Latino Americans, and indigenous folks are more likely to live next to a coal-fired power plant. And from cradle to grave, we talk about the impacts of coal-based energy production, where 76,000 coal miners have died of black lung disease since 1968, while the National Mining Association has consistently fought against the very protections that would have protected the miners from the impacts of coal in their lungs. We hear of mountaintop removal, where not only is it blasting these beautiful mountaintops away, but also contaminating the waterways that are beneath. The power of those blasts are disturbing the foundations of homes, and the emissions that go into the air from those blasts are causing many health impacts in places that are resident next to these mountaintop removal operations. And then we talk about coal burning. The emissions that come out of these smokestacks include mercury, arsenic, lead, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, which is tied to everything from birth defects to respiratory illnesses. And so we see those impacts in communities. And then we talk about our waste systems. Each and every one of our waste systems point up the need for serious systems change, because the way that each of them are designed are harming people and planet. So our waste systems, or after the BP oil drilling disaster, the bulk of the waste went into these landfills that are sited in communities of color, because most landfills are sited in communities of color because the property values are lower, and landfills take up a lot of space. And unfortunately, with landfills, they're under-regulated. So you have landfill liners that'll eventually erode. In places like Jackson, Tennessee, there was a landfill liner that eroded, and trichloroethylene, which is a known carcinogen, got into the water supply of a community that was living next to a landfill. And the community ended up having all these rare forms of cancer, birth defects, and so forth. And they found out that when that trichloroethylene leak happened, the white families were sent letters telling them not to drink the water, and the African American families weren't sent those letters. And so this is why we had this cancer cluster of just the black families in that community. Even the animal shelter was put on an alternate form of water, and the African American families weren't informed at all. And so, yes, then they were absolutely found culpable for it, and they had to pay a $33 million settlement, but that only just shows their culpability. It certainly doesn't give back the lives that were lost after that contamination. So, another video I would have shown you, but we'll just keep going. So when we talk about our food systems, whether it is the Gwich'in community in Alaska, especially now that we know, we're hearing about the rollback of the protections for the Alaskan Native villages. This is a quote from the Gwich'in Nation. "It is our belief that the future of the Gwich'in and the future of the caribou are the same. Harm to the porcupine caribou herd is harm to the Gwich'in culture and millennia-old way of life." And this is happening in community after community, whether it's the Gwich'in people or the Inuit nations or so forth and so on, where this blatant disregard for their well-being, for their culture, for their food supply is just being trampled on by an administration that is pulling back on the very protections that were meant to preserve these very resources. We have a situation where you have companies like Monsanto that are creating seeds that only have one life cycle, which is against literally the very essence of nature. And so these seeds, they're calling them terminator seeds. They're blowing over, and they act as a virus when they get onto someone else's crops, and they kind of take over. And so that crop is now dependent on those very seeds in order to have a crop every year. And so now people whose crops just regenerate every year are now dependent on buying these seeds from Monsanto. And you have situations, there's a person named Vandana Shiva has done a lot of studies around this, and she has found this increase in suicide among farmers as a result of this, and then other factors like the drying up of crops in general because of the impacts of climate change. So also, as it relates to our food systems, we have factory farming, whether it's commercial animal feeding operations, where it's not only inhumane to the animals, but also the communities that are disproportionately exposed tend to be communities of color and low-income communities who are suffering from not only the noxious fumes, but also the pollution from these operations. With our water systems, we talked about Flint. Also in Alaska, the Red Dog Mine has violated the Clean Water Act 600 times, and yet it's allowed to continue to operate. They can pay the fine, but they just kind of keep going and keep polluting and keep contaminating because the system is made to kind of support these types of corporations, but not necessarily the health and rights of the communities. So, and again, sorry about the lack of video. This is supposed to be like not me droning on and on. The little videos would have given us a few breaks, but are we just completely giving up on that? They're not even working. Okay, all right, good, all right. So I will, so I'll probably just kind of brush through and not tell you as much as I would have because, yeah, that would be a long time. So also we talk about not only contamination, but we also have situations where there's communities where their very affordability and access to water is threatened by people who are living in poverty or by water privatization that then results in people not necessarily having access. So whether it's Detroit, where they've shut off water to thousands of residents. In Baltimore, at one year, they had 23,000 folks who were on the list to get their water shut off. These are the kind of things that are happening because of whether it's privatization or just because of poverty, grinding poverty that's affected communities. And so So another system we talk about is transportation and goods movement. Again, the near roadway air pollution is harmful, and it disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income communities, whether it's roadways or whether it's shipping channels. These tend to be disproportionately harming the health and well-being of communities and communities of color. And so we see impacts from all of this exposure. It's including respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular illnesses, gastrointestinal illnesses, and so forth. Whether African-American children are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter into the hospital from asthma attack, and 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack. African-American adults are more likely to die of lung cancer, but less likely to smoke. And this is because of it's tied to what they're being exposed to in terms of poor air quality. The Dixon family is the family I was telling you about in Dixon, Tennessee, actually, where they were the family that lived next to the landfill that where their water supply was contaminated. This is a family in a place called in the Four Corners region of out west, and it's a Navajo, a Dene family. And the coal-fired power plant behind them is one of 4 coal-fired power plants within a 30-mile radius of their lands. They have the 2 coolers on the porch because they, like 70% of the people who live on those lands, do not have electricity. So the electricity is being generated by the 4 coal-fired power plants that are polluting them is going to supply Las Vegas. It used to be Los Angeles before they weaned themselves from coal. Phoenix and other places. And so they are host to the pollution from the coal plants, but don't even get the actual electricity that's being generated. They're holding up a picture of someone in their family who passed away of a respiratory illness. They talk about the children having asthma. They talk about the woman who is on your left who is pregnant, and we know that mercury is one of the things that comes out of these smokestacks, and it's a known endocrine disruptor and known to be tied to birth defects. So they really gifted us with this image to be able to tell the story of these impacts that they're suffering under. We put out a report called Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as if Human Rights Matter. And it was really recognizing that whether folks didn't have electricity in the first place, like the Navajo family, or the many communities like the folks who have their water, their water shut off, they're also having their electricity shut off. Sorry, it's my water. Sorry, speaking of water. Sorry. That was bad. Okay, so we decided to tell this story because last year we read too many stories of people who had actually died because they used a candle to light their home after their electricity was shut off, or they had their oil and gas shut off for non-payment and they used a space heater to heat their home. One person last summer, she was a grandmother who, I'm trying to think if I have her. She was a grandmother, and she wasn't able to pay her electricity bill, and her son ended up paying $200 on the bill once he found out that she was having a hard time, but the system didn't catch up in time. So they shut off her electricity in the dead of like a record heat, and not only was she dependent on a respirator, which was then not operable, but she was also in this burning heat, and she passed away. And so we just read too many stories of people who literally paid the price of poverty with their very lives, and we're calling out for the injustice of these kind of situations. So, and then we also talk about other impacts of this exposure. The story of this young man, Antoine, who was a grandson of 2 people who came to one of our trainings, and they brought us this and gave us this picture of his bag of medicines and talked about how he's dependent on these medicines to get from day to day because he lives 2 miles away from a coal-fired power plant. The poor air quality is always there in his community, and they talk about how concerned they get when he literally can't draw breath. And then they sent us this picture of him, Antoine there, is looking on while the child is playing in the fountain. And they really said that this was kind of symbolic of his life, that whether he's looking out the window and kids are going to school, but he can't go because it's a poor air quality day, or he can't play like other kids because his lung capacity is so much lower. And they said this is why we're in that training, and this is why they want to do this work around environmental justice, because of the well-being and the future of their grandson. But then we make the other ties too, because if you're living next to a toxic facility like Antoine's family and others, then not only do you have these health impacts, but also you have under-resourcing of your infrastructure, because on average your property values are lower if you live next to a toxic facility. So for us, we look at the fact that if you're having a hard time paying attention in school because lead comes out of these smokestacks, you're not in school as much because you can't go to school on poor air quality days, and then the property, and then the quality of your school is lower, then you are not necessarily being able to attain the same grade level as others. And studies show that if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, you're more likely to enter the school to prison pipeline. So we see these intersections, and consider this to be, so when we consider climate justice to be inclusive of health justice, of education justice, of criminal justice, and so forth and so on, because it's all inextricably interconnected. So when we talk about the other side of climate impacts, that was just on the driver's side in terms of the pollutants that drive climate change and how they impact communities as well. But then many of the same communities are vulnerable to the other side of the climate change impacts resulting from when the world starts to warm and all of the impacts that we see. So whether it's just in agricultural yields, in these very same communities where, like in Flint, for example, the absorption of the lead in their systems would not have been so rampant and so deep if they had had a proper nutritional kind of access as children, because that's the one thing that would have, having iron in your system and other nutrients would have guarded against the absorption of lead into the blood. And so we have the same communities that are more likely to be exposed to lead in their water systems that are also less likely to have food security. And so many people call communities food deserts when they don't have access to food, but some of the folks who are in the food justice movement don't like the term food desert because it implies something that happens naturally. And they know that the communities are separated from these resources because of history of redlining or modern day gentrification and displacement and other ways that by design communities are separated from resources. So the shifts in agricultural yields resulting from climate change, one of the impacts is that nutritional food is less available, less affordable, and so forth. So you have folks getting food from a corner store, which is high in sodium, high in preservatives, high in sugars, and low in anything of any nutritional value whatsoever. And particularly when you have these communities where we are more likely to have these chronic health conditions that are so diet sensitive, on top of the fact that having the proper nutrients and vitamins would actually be a buffer against some of the negative exposures that these communities are facing. So one of my friends, she's white, and she said her son Milo came home from school one day and said, "Mom, why are all the black kids in my class rich?" And she's like, "What do you mean, Milo?" And he said, "Well, all the white kids have like carrots and celery in our lunch, but they have like Doritos and Cheetos and like all the good stuff." And so I was like, that was just so ironic and everything weird. But so we really had a conversation about that, like about the perception of wealth or perception of access and choices versus the reality and what that story really tells. So when we talk about disasters, that communities of vulnerability are often more likely to be harmed by disasters because of whether it's poor housing stock or poor infrastructure that makes flooding more likely. Also, you often find that low-income communities, and even in communities of color that aren't even necessarily low-income, but are low wealth, are more likely to be in floodplains, and therefore when disasters happen, these communities tend to be more impacted. And then when you also combine the fact that these toxic facilities are more likely to be in communities, then when disasters strike and impact disaster facilities, impact these toxic facilities, then they're more likely to harm the communities as well. So you see these types of intersections. I'm just going to breeze past some of this. And so, just because of time. And then when we talk about sea level rise, this is another way that communities are impacted, whether you're in floodplains, and then with sea level rise, you're more likely to get flooded, or you get displaced because your land is literally overtaken by the water as it encroaches. Places like Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, where they had the first group of folks who had to be moved because their land has been overtaken by the water. Or in the Maldives, where they actually had a cabinet meeting underwater to illustrate internally into the world that that's where they're going to be in 20 years. But that was in 2009, so now it's less than 10 years that they're going to be underwater. They actually built a seawall around their nation, if you can see the wall there, to try to stave off. But by 20, pretty soon, they're going to be, even that wall is going to be overtaken, so they're not going to be able to continue to sustain life there. And so in the United States, whether it's Thibodaux, Louisiana, or Kivalina in Alaska, there are many places that are facing imminent displacement because of sea level rise. The NOAA official said that today's flood is going to be equal to tomorrow's high tide. So what we just call high tide is going to be the flooding is going to be just as normal as what we call high tide. And so we talk about these impacts of disasters and so forth, but then we have the impacts of the inequities and how we're responding to them, which follow the same patterns that left communities vulnerable in the first place. Whether it's the use of prisoners as labor after disasters without the proper training or covering or so forth. And right here in California, we all know about inmates being used as to fight fires. We're actually doing a report on inmate labor and disaster that's really looking at the fact that often, even though you're not forced into it, there's a certain level of pressure for folks to be used in these circumstances. And then also we're looking at some of the county records where inmates are literally listed as commodities with a price tag next to them, just like a tractor or so forth. Inmates are literally listed just on a spreadsheet. We also look at who's most impacted, who's able to bounce back from disasters. And after the tornadoes and flooding of 2011, I took this picture in Huntsville, Alabama. I was just struck by how every last person in line who was getting food was African American, and every last person in the line who was providing the food was white American. And that just struck me in terms of who was able to bounce back, who wasn't impacted in the first place, who was in need versus who was able to be in a service position. And then when I went outside, similarly, I looked up on stage at the town hall meeting and saw the people from FEMA, the people from Red Cross, the people from local government were all white and largely men, and the people who were lined up at the mic who needed services, who needed information, who needed help were all African American women, which also struck me because then looking back inside, all the people who were standing in line getting the food were also largely men, while the women were out there getting the information. And so that's a whole other story. But and then when we talk about infrastructure and who's impacted the most and why, I was in the aftermath of Hurricane Isaac. I was in Louisiana and watching the news actually, and they were asking, after I had been to Plaquemines Parish and saw where it was just inundated by the weather there, when I was watching the news, they were interviewing the Senator Mary Landrieu, and asked her why it was that it was 7 years after Katrina, why it was that the levees hadn't been fortified in Plaquemines Parish. And she said, she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question, and they said that they use a formula to decide which levees, how they're going to prioritize which levees are fortified. And the formula applied points to each levy based on what the economic impact would be if the levy was breached. So it had nothing to do with people or who was most vulnerable. It was all about, and so it literally was yet another case where property values actually determined who was protected as opposed to actual vulnerability or any regard for human life. And so that also, there's a book called Weapons of Math Destruction that actually looks at how our formulas in our society are set up to perpetuate inequity. And that really is a prime example, again, of people paying the price of poverty with their lives. And so when we talk about intersections, this is a picture and 2 stories that happened on the same day in the Associated Press. And when it was 2 white people that were pictured, it says 2 residents wade through chest-deep flood waters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Katrina. And then when it's an African-American male that's listed, it's a young man walks through chest-deep flood waters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. So literally the exact same circumstance, the exact same act, the exact same driver of their actions, but being cast in very different ways. And so we see how that results in the disproportionate criminalization of some folks, and we saw how it resulted in people actually being, people who were coming to go and find their lost relatives in Katrina on the Danziger Bridge were literally unarmed, shot and killed by the police. And it's that same racial profiling and pattern of just living while black that can actually be a death sentence for people. And so we see how, again, all of this is so horribly interconnected in a way that makes us have to look at systems change instead of just trying to tweak little pieces of the system, because so many of the systems are interconnected and so deeply broken and so against certain people in society. And so we also talk about gender justice, how women are disproportionately impacted by climate change as well, whether it's the women in the Horn of Africa who are having to walk further because their duty is to carry water, the women and girls, women being used as weapons in war in different places, or the violence against women that happens after disaster, not just in sub-Saharan Africa or other places, but here in the United States. After the BP oil drilling disaster, the police blotters had a quadrupling of violence against women. After Katrina, we also saw a spike in violence against women. And then around the extraction of oil and gas, we see the situation where they have what they call man camps and many missing and murdered indigenous women that are around these oil and gas operations. So this is a known and documented thing that's hardly ever talked about in the general media. And so when I do a lot of work in Laredo, Texas now with this project that we're working on around food security, around job creation, and around solar installations for a place where that gets more days above 100 degrees than Death Valley. And the stories that I hear of people coming through because of climate forced migration, because they can no longer grow crops where they are in Central America, they can no longer grow crops where they are in Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of folks come from Sub-Saharan Africa up to the US through Central America. And then when I look at, as I said before, US being 4% of the global population, yet 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. And so we are so responsible for driving people from their lands. But yet when people come here through climate forced migration, we have these increasingly punitive policies to try to keep people out, even though we're responsible for them coming in the first place. And this quote from Warshan Shirway, a Kenyan-born Somali poet, really said it all. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So really people are just trying to survive. They're trying to survive themselves, they're trying to survive for their children. And we hear how many stories of people not even surviving in the crossing because of being willing to take that risk and not actually surviving, taking that risk. So I'm going to freeze. But anyway, these are just some of the mental health impacts of climate change and the implications that we see there. And so when we talk about moving to solutions, the question is, what do we do about all of this? So first, we have all the false solutions that we are engaged in. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "All progress is precarious, and the solution of one problem brings us face to face with another problem." Whether it's the market-based mechanisms like cap and trade, or whether it's this notion of clear cutting, cutting down forests to then grow corn to then use as fuel, or whether it's this notion of population control being the answer when, this is a world of so much regenerative resources, but yet it's just our abuse of the resources that are really the challenge, and consumerism, or this notion of clean coal or natural gas, which we know has caused so many problems, whether it's contamination of water or the increase in seismic activity in Oklahoma, where on average they used to have 30 earthquakes per year above 3.5 on the Richter scale. Now they're averaging, since fracking, 300 earthquakes per year above 3.5 on the Richter scale. And so they're trying to push for a ban on fracking, and as you know, places like New York and Maryland, we just got a ban on fracking. Denton, Texas, randomly also got a ban on fracking. But so recognizing these negative impacts, but we continue here, these homes exploding because of natural gas, and so many challenges there. There was a home, I don't know if I have, there's a home in Granger Township in Ohio where they had a home. The home exploded, and when they tested the water, they found that the explosivity level was 20%, which is 20 times the allowable level of explosivity, which I was surprised that there was allowable level of explosivity in our drinking water, but that was a whole another thing once again. But yeah. And so, I talked about the earthquakes in Oklahoma. And then on top of it all, we have a situation where many of our nuclear reactors are built on earthquake fault zones. So as we have this increase in earthquakes and seismic activities, we're really flirting with disaster. And the ones with the black triangle here are ones that are built in the same design as the Fukushima Daiichi plant there that was impacted by the tsunami situation there. So we're really flirting with disaster with this fracking. And so all other, even as we try to do climate action plans and so forth, some of them actually result in gentrification and displacement. So everything that we do, we have to be very deliberative about how we do it, because the best of intentions can go awry if we aren't careful. So why is this all happening so unchecked, and why do we even find communities being instruments of our own destruction? So to quote from Todd Gitlin: "To win power anywhere, you have to convince people that you can do something for them." And we see the situation where, I know with the NAACP, we have companies coming in and saying, we can offer you jobs and we can do this and that, and it's the very same companies that are polluting our communities. And so we're really trying to ramp up so that we can do mass education and get folks to really understand how there's this attempt at manipulation. We put out a report on April 1st called Fossil Fuel Foolery, the top 10 manipulation tactics of the fossil fuel industry. So we can really begin to have that political education as a community about the ways that they're trying to manipulate us. This is one such situation where in Mississippi, these are all reverends who signed on in support of this initiative that this corporation was doing, and they really had gotten in and made friends with these black reverends, and so they all kind of ended up carrying water for these corporations that were really, focused on polluting our communities for a profit. But because they had managed to curry these relationships, these folks were carrying water for them, and so this is the kind of thing we have to actively work against to help folks to understand how they are being manipulated by these entities. So we know some of the driving forces behind it in terms of the folks who are seeking profits. This group they call the International Forum on Globalization made this, they call the Coctopus. They talked about all the different world manipulation tactics and the influence, people who are influenced by this, what they call Coke Cash, in terms of the Koch brothers. to the extent that even though the very evidence of global warming is staring us on the face, we still have people who can claim that we still have the climate deniers who can claim that it's not happening. So, another quote from Martin Luther King: "Law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress." And this is what we're seeing with how people are using our very laws and policies and so forth against us. And so whether it's the super PACs that are literally stomping on our democracy, or groups that are getting in with our own legislators, targeting the Congressional Black Caucus, targeting the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the other groups to try to get them to again carry water for them. They had a net metering, which is, anyways, there was a policy that was kind of written straight out of Alec's playbook that came through the NAACP and made it pretty far because they made it sound like it was in favor of solar. But when you read down in the whereas clauses, you see where it's not. Similarly, just this year, another resolution came through, and it came from these folks. It was played straight out of the ALEC playbook, but the resolution was called like "Safe and Healthy Drinking Water for All." But then when you read it, it's all about water privatization. And so these are the kind of things that they sneak in to try to manipulate communities to act against their own self-interest. So, and then these very companies, whether it's oil and gas countries or otherwise, are paying into groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that is pushing forward on everything from prison privatization to water privatization to voter suppression and so forth. And yet, when we're paying our electricity bill to these folks, we're actually in effect playing into these systems as well. And this is why we find it so important to do this political education so that we begin to understand how all these things are interconnected. Halliburton applied for, so just speaking of how our laws can be manipulated, they applied for an exemption for their fracking from the Safe Drinking Water Act. The fact that there's even a process by which you can apply for an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act lets us know that things are not where they're supposed. And the fact that they even made progress in being considered for an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act, again, tells us how flawed our political system is and how tied it is to our economic system. And so you have the situation where folks are trying to roll back the very regulations that would protect our lives and our well-being, and again, being driven by the well-moneyed interests of some of these corporations. So this is another video I would have shown you, but I think we have officially given up on the AV situation, but I definitely encourage you to watch that. So what do we do moving forward? Sorry, that's good old Charlie Brown, and it's stuck on that now. I don't know why. I don't know. Okay, let me just go do this. Okay. Maybe that's why I was plugged in. Maybe it was almost dead. So I'll just plug it back in, I guess. All right. So as we talk about what the just transition that we need to make, how do we help uphold the beloved community? We are part of this group called the Climate Justice Alliance that talks about the transition we need to make away from an extractive economy, which, as this whole presentation meant to illustrate just how extractive and exploitive and our economy is, and how it's built on principles and practices of domination, kind of survival of the fittest and so forth, and then extraction and exploitation. And we really are a part of a group of folks who are saying that we need to shift all of our systems into a living economy that is really embodied by principles and practices around deep democracy, around solidarity, around caring economy, and around regenerative systems that are built on cooperation and so forth, and where we're living in harmony with the earth, not always trying to extract from the earth as cheaply as possible. And so the practical measures of that really talk about us having to change the way we're doing things kind of all around. So we have this political and governance system that's built on moneyed interests being able to control the decision makers and the decision making. We have these systems are tied up and perpetuated by our economic, financial, manufacturing, trade, and labor systems. We have a food and agricultural system that is, again, not as accessible to many folks in terms of nutritious and healthy foods, and then it's again, trying to create food as cheaply as possible without regard to harms to health, harms to the earth, or otherwise. Similarly, with our waste and recycling, instead of having a recycling system or having more regenerative systems, we have this so much waste. We're wasting energy, we're wasting water, we're wasting just goods in general. We have an energy system, again, with so much waste, but then also produced largely by the most harmful practices imaginable. And a transportation system that's built on kind of single car transportation as opposed to really valuing and supporting mass transit, so we don't have as much pollution from transit. We also have to make a transition from some of the underpinnings of so many of the disparities that we have around poverty, around racism, around sexism, around all the various, around LGBTQI discrimination, and all the various challenges that we have that form the basis for discrimination, and for some folks to be at the bottom of the ladder of rights for our society. So as we move forward, we talk about first advancing true democracy, getting money out of politics. We talk about overturning Citizens United, and making sure that we're at the table, whether it's at a local city council meeting or a zoning board, or it's voting for the president of the United States or a school board, like, and everything in between, making sure that we really are fully participating in our democracy and understanding the decisions that are being made. And when we do so, we have folks in office who actually care about the rights of the people. Now with Flint, the community has risen up. They've gotten rid of the emergency financial manager. They have a democratically elected mayor who is now moving work that is really where human rights is at the center of the work that they're doing. And so really begin to thrive as a community as a result. And as we build towards a democracy, making sure that we are fighting against the very, as we push for the good, we're also continuing to fight and resist the bad. This video would have been of this community where it was a youth-led movement to keep an incinerator out of a community called Curtis Bay in Baltimore, where they were building this largest incinerator. It would have been the largest incinerator in the country, but this community of youth really got together and fought back against it, and were successful in winning that fight. And the youth, Destiny Watford, who was 17 years old at the time, won the Goldman Prize, which is the national recognized prize for that victory. And we have common cause with folks in sub-Saharan Africa where they're fighting similar battles, and they have this is in Durban, where they're talking about stopping the 1% from profiting from pollution. This is some of the UN climate talks where, again, folks are coming from around the world under the same kind of challenge that we're seeing nation after nation in terms of polluters even controlling what's happening in the United Nations. We had signed a memorandum of agreement with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance because we find common cause around the challenges that are happening in sub-Saharan Africa and the challenges that are happening in African descendant communities in the United States. We were part of this campaign around Bank of America, which was funding coal. And as a result of mass action, Bank of America is no longer funding coal. And it's a good thing because they were having a relationship with the NAACP. Meanwhile, I'm walking around showing this banner at everywhere I was going. That wasn't going over so well. They called up our econ department, which works very closely with them, and they were like, what's this with the your person showing this funding coal killing communities thing? So they called me up, and I'm like, well, yeah, they are funding coal, and it is killing our communities. I don't know what you want me to do. So anyway, but these are the kind of things that are happening. So we're working on gender justice with folks, finding common cause around the disproportionate impacts and the ways that women are rising up in leadership. And then, of course, with recognizing the immigration rights as such an important part for the reasons that I talked about before. We actually did this Black Lives Matter action in, let's see if I can go back, in Paris, at the UN climate talks in Paris. And we were talking about how whether, folks are being shot down in the streets or folks are being killed a death of 1,000 cuts from having to ingest this pollution, it's the same impact, of disproportionate impact of pollution on communities. And so we did one of the biggest kind of documented and recorded actions at the UN Paris Climate Talks, when these African American youth from all around the country came together and did this action. And it was funny because I was on my way they had stayed up all night making signs and so forth, and they called me while I was trying to navigate in French the metro system there in Paris, and they said, they took our signs, they confiscated our signs. And it was because it was right after the Charlie Hebdo, the terrorist attack that happened there. And so they were concerned about, there was a heightened level of security at the UN climate talks. And so they had confiscated the signs. And so I got there, and I was the only person who spoke any French at all. So I got there, and I was like trying to negotiate with the police. And they were like, well, what do the signs say? And I said, well, they say things like, we need higher ambition. And, meanwhile, the signs were like, F the police. And so I was like, so it was kind of crazy. But anyway, so we're working with groups like the Associated, with groups like the Interfaith Moral Action on Climate. We occupy the front of the American Petroleum Institute, so API. That's why the sign says it's immoral to wreck our planet with your dirty fossil fuels. We organize with groups like the Franciscan Brothers to really talk about how climate change is a moral issue. We're active around the fracking ban in Maryland. Really, another video I would have shown you of this community in Highland Park, Michigan, where they had their streetlights cut off for non-payment there. And it's, again, a largely African-American, but overall lower income community. And so when they had their streetlights cut off by DTE, Detroit Edison, for non-payment, then the community got together and they literally had bake sales, lemonade sales, did all they could, and they raised enough money to buy little solar panels that they put on all their streetlights. Because DTE had not only cut off the streetlights, but they came and they took the poles away. They decided people were never going to be able to pay the bills. And so they really just organized, got poles, got little solar panels, and so now they're back in the light after community action and community organizing. And that's really what it's all about. And so, like with the group there that I talked about in the Four Corners region out west, now there's groups like the Black Mesa Water Coalition. In the bottom picture, we have folks from Southwest Workers Union in San Antonio, Texas, from Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, from Eastern Michigan Environmental Action Coalition in Detroit, all coming together under this banner of power without pollution, energy without injustice. So these communities are coming together to say, how can we band together and do the same thing that the Highland Park folks did, generate our own energy, start to finance our own work so we're not reliant on these various companies that are making us the weapons of our own destruction. So you have programs coming up like Grid Alternatives, where we work with them last year to do a solar installation at the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention. So it not only provided solar panels for their housing, but it also trained the women who are survivors of domestic violence in these jobs, and now they're actually employed in the solar industry as a result. And we know that financial dependence is one of the things that often keeps women in these violent situations. So to be able to do all of that, again, this intersectional approach where it's not only energy, it's economic justice, it's gender justice, all in kind of one thing. So we really see that intersectional approaches are the ways to do this work. So we're partnering with groups like Grid Alternatives, Vote Solar, and so forth to implement these kind of models. And then, of course, building the local food movement. You have places where they're tilling the soil on one side, on the other, they're enjoying the bounty from the food that they have produced themselves, and that is in Kansas City. Another great video I would have shown you where these youth are singing about having better nutrition, and they talk about the types of foods that are marketed in their communities and having to make better choices in spite of the fact that they often don't have enough choices, and how do they actually start to grow their own food to counter what's just available to them in their corner stores otherwise. And so even we talk about how improving our educational system, how green schools actually result in better teacher attendance, less student absenteeism, and improved test scores. So the studies have shown that when you have a green school, that the comparison before and after is actually quite marked. And then there's a lot of work around transitioning from burying our waste in landfills or burning it in incinerators to actually recycling, which actually produces jobs while also saving our environment, and it costs less as well. And then we talk about needing to have equity-based transportation systems and how it also leads to better jobs as well because people can get to jobs and so forth. And then affordable, equitable, and sustainable housing. We launched this initiative called Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector, so that, because we find that communities are often the ones that are in the least energy efficient buildings, in the most disaster vulnerable buildings, and the sickest buildings in terms of whether it's mold or asbestos and so forth. So we're talking about how do we universalizing having healthy, safe, disaster resilient buildings. And so we brought together a number of different sectors to talk about how do we shift this kind of access to affordable housing, schools, and so forth. And so, and same with clean water for all. How are we actually shifting our water systems through participatory processes, through direct action, as we saw with the Standing Rock and so forth. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "One day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America?" And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? And that's from his "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" So, and as I said before, all of the work that we do gets tied up with economic justice. It's tied up with restoration and restorative justice and healing. And it's also tied up with telling our own stories. We talked about the narrative before around folks finding versus looting and all the ways that those narratives actually have lethal impacts in our communities. Whether it's stories like even with President Obama, he had this all of the above strategy as a result related to our energy system. But unfortunately, the political climate is such that even someone like that, who's supposed to be in the most powerful office, finds themselves making compromises that aren't necessarily for the well-being of our communities, because all of the above should not include nuclear, should not include natural gas. It should really be, a little bit of a tighter focus. But I think he found himself having to make what he considered to be a compromise to get further. But we really need to, now we've been given by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a 12-year countdown, and we can no longer afford to make compromises at this point. We have to kind of move pretty resolutely forward. And so this is a quote from African proverb: "Until lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." I was also watching Saturday Night Live one night. I thought they told the story, that kind of same concept pretty well. And it was a skit where they were doing Weekend Update, like a fake news thing that they do. And so they were saying, as told in a local newspaper, hunter thinking deer was dead was injured as the deer jumped up and gored him. And then the headline was "Deer Attacks Hunter." And then it said, or as the story was told in the deer community, serial killer injured as victim fights back. And so this is really the illustration of why we need to be telling our own stories, because it's a very different perspective. So I think, so yeah, so when we talk about whether it's telling our own stories or leading on our own solutions, the importance of kind of frontline communities being in the lead is what we're always emphasizing. We do have our own solutions. We do have we know exactly what we need. And so we talk about these principles of democratic organizing, including being inclusive, emphasizing bottom-up organizing, letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships amongst ourselves, and committing to self-transformation. this would have been the last video that I would have shown you. I definitely recommend that you watch it. It's called Dear Matafeli Pinam, and it's written by a woman from the Marshall Islands. And it's a poem she wrote to her little baby, and it's very kind of inspiring as it relates to climate change. So kind of where do we go from here? Besides those big systems change questions, boils down to what individual actions that we can take. So whether it's doing things like what you're doing here, having educational sessions, film screenings, special speakers, discussions in churches, healing walks, healing hikes, and so forth, community cleanups. These are ways that folks can at least begin to take actions that hopefully also lead to the larger actions like getting out the vote, like passing clean air ordinances, like starting zero waste programs, getting your school to be a green school, starting community-owned solar co-ops, starting local food movements, all of this, and starting a community emergency response team, becoming an eco-village, running for office. All of these things kind of add up into the collective action that we need to take as a nation to make these transitions. Cultivating cross-movement organizing an anti-oppression training, integrating equity into a local climate action plan, and so forth. So just wrapping up with this is a group called Sustain Us, and this is one of the climate meetings where they were, basically talking about how we all are interconnected and that we are interdependent on each other. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "We have before us the glorious opportunity to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization." So, thank you. That's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Is it like Q&A or what?
Yes, so
Okay.
now I'd like to open it up for questions. What I'll do is I'll pass around the microphone, and if you wouldn't mind answering any questions that the students have.
Okay.
And also our community members.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I'll start off. I can talk loud enough. Jack,
Yes.
I travel all around the United States, and I see you all around, and I see you everywhere. And you talk about narratives, but to me, the narrative is that you do these young people a disservice when you come in here and you don't talk about the racism and the anti-blackness in the justice movement, in the climate justice movement. You sat up here and told these students about CJA, but you did not tell them about the racism and the anti-blackness of CJA. But you sat up there and taunted that organization like it was one of the greatest organizations going. The NAACP. We have numerous black communities around the country. Paramore, Miami, Vallejo. We don't see the NAACP nowhere. You are the director of the NAACP. I've talked to you on numerous occasions. I have seen you at least 8 times all around the country in the last year. You running around and doing presentations to me is disrespectful, is disingenuous to our communities because you are not following through. So when you get narratives, all these slides and stuff sound beautiful. But when you go to my community, when you go to these other people's communities, we see y'all nowhere. There's no funding, there's no programming, there's nothing. But yet and still, you can fly all around the country and be seen everywhere. So how are you doing your job and helping our communities? And I see you all the time and I bring this up, but you never do anything. And yet still, you're still in line with an organization that's anti-black. There's other advocates in here who've been around and have dealt with the same thing, but you sat up there and you taunted them as if they're the know-all and get-all. And every time you stood up there, black, 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 black. But yet you're affiliated with organizations that are anti-black. So I'm an advocate, and I'm for justice, and when you're an advocate, you're for justice. So you cannot sit on the stage and run that narrative about black, but your actions are not following behind it. And these are facts. So these are not something that's personal. These are facts. So I want to know, what do you want to do besides running around the country, giving talks, that you're going to do what the NAACP...
Go ahead and address it.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I invited Ms. Patterson.
I know, but you said that this is going to be an open forum. So if it has to be group thinking, I'm going to answer, but if you want us all to sit in here and be group thinkers, if you want these young people to not speak truth to power, what I'm speaking is a fact. If I'm sitting up there telling her that something that's a lie, then that's something different. We don't want these young people to leave out of here and be group thinkers and think because we all supposed to be in the same thing, that we all get along, that we cannot bring out our own things that need to be addressed.
I appreciate that. Let him respond.
Yeah, so definitely the Climate Justice Alliance has had some conversations. As you know, the Black Caucus came out of that to really have some conversations around how, I mean, unfortunately, anti-Black racism is so ingrained in our society that it shows up in a lot of different places. And so even though I mean, the slide I showed around the just transition framework is very much the framework that we believe is necessary in terms of moving from an extractive economy, there's definitely work to be done within the movement itself because anti-Blackness shows up everywhere. And that's why there's a Black Caucus within Climate Justice Alliance, for folks who don't know, that came up to really start to address some of the challenges that people were facing around anti-Blackness that folks were encountering. So that's the answer to that question. There was a lot of questions in there. And the NAACP has 2,200 branches and chapters across the country, and there's a lot of great work that's happening in the various chapters across the country. Where out of 2,200 branches and chapters and 500,000 members, we have a team of 10. So there are definitely limitations and constraints to how much we can do in different places. And as I said before, in terms of communities not necessarily even being on board with the climate justice agenda that we have worked with, and we really do want, to have organic, letting people speak for themselves, bottom-up organizing. So for us, we can't force communities to do it if they're not going to do it. We can only kind of respond to the communities that are interested in doing the work. And so, as I said, all the projects that I referred to are the projects where there are communities that are interested in doing the work. Others, we offer to help, but if they're not able to, then they're not moving forward, then there's only so much we can do. Some have evolved over time. Like there are places like St. Louis, Missouri, where when we first went to them and said, oh, there's a coal plant here, they were like, well, Peabody Coal, they're our friends. They give us, money for our Freedom Fund banquet every year. And so we're like, oh, okay, but we kept in touch with them and we kept in conversation with them. And then one year when we went and we testified against coal down at the EPA, then Peabody didn't send them their check that year. And so that's when they found out what the friendship was based on. And Peabody said, well, we're not giving you that money because you went against us to EPA. And so then since then, the St. Louis branch has become one of our strongest branches because they saw the light. And so we're trying to, we kind of stay in relationship with folks even when they're not necessarily on board and help them to see the light. And as we've talked about last time, in the various communities where the NAACP isn't active, we can't, whether it's Paramore or Vallejo or other places, we can't kind of force them to act because that's just not, because we are trying to live by these principles of bottom-up organizing. So, yes. Did you have?
Okay. I'm the secretary of our local branch.
Okay, good.
NAACP,
Yes.
And we do appear throughout the community, and we are active. However, like any organization, you gotta have boots on the ground.
Yes.
And if you can't wear out the people that are willing to do the work.
Exactly, yes.
And that seems to be an issue everywhere.
Yes, exactly. That's so true. Yeah, so that's often so we went to a place like Seattle, for example, where there was capacity even, and we're like, oh, you're interested in doing this? And they were like, well, we've got our hands full with this criminal justice situation, with this economic development situation. So then I said, well, we have this great project we'd love for you to pilot. It's a Power Up Employment project where it's working with formerly incarcerated persons and doing job creation and getting them on solar rooftops and so they're like, okay, yeah. So we really try to meet people where they are. We're like, okay, what are your priorities and how can we help with that? As opposed to saying, on top of all the stuff that you're doing and the sleep you're not getting and the meals you aren't having, try to do this too. We're really trying to meet folks where we are. So I look forward to actually even having a conversation with you to figure out what might be some possibilities here. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, research has shown that transitioning to a plant-based diet actually will help with climate change. And I'm wondering if your organization or if you know of any organizations that you're connected schools, especially in our underserved communities, and also making children in underserved communities more aware of the importance of plant-based diets and nutrition. But I'm just wondering, our whole food system is so messed up, and the factory farms impacting the environment so detrimentally. We really need a major shift by 2050. We only have a few years left, and I'm wondering what strides these organizations that you know of have made in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the local food projects that I talked about are doing a lot in that direction because the foods that they're producing locally are vegetables and so forth, and they are doing work around education. We actually just spoke at the Reducitarian Summit. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's helping folks to kind of be on a path, recognizing that getting folks to kind of stop, for lack of a better phrase, cold turkey. But anyway, but to stop is can be a challenge. And so the Reducitarian Summit is about well, how can we start to reduce in some ways? And so we're working with groups that are doing things like the Meatless Mondays, and we have this group called the Land of Kush, that does all vegetarian foods that caters our events. And so we introduced that to different groups, and so between the local food work that we do, working with folks on that, and some of the initiatives around meatless, and then our own kind of catering and trying to get folks, and then being a part of this reducitarian movement, those are some of the ways that we're starting to see. And then we talk about, without being too, because there's so many cultural connections there and so forth, so we have to be very respectful and not, because we had someone come in and they were talking about how, you're eating dead food, and it was not a very, resonant message. And so we're trying to be as kind of culturally resonant as possible while helping folks to see what opportunities there are to make this shift. And so we're doing, I don't know if I said it, but we're doing a lot of work with aquaponics now to work on folks being able to grow their own food, and a lot with just kind of recipes and demonstrations and helping people to see that it can actually be good, as opposed to just like a necessary evil. And so, yeah, so those are some of the work that's happening. Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Jackie. This is LaDonna Williams.
Yes,
and
hi.
we've met in various venues as well.
Yes.
I first want to say thank you for the presentation. You brought a lot of issues together. And so that I want to say thank you. But I also want to commend Eric for pushing the envelope because, as you know, he has that passion, and I love it. Every time I run into him, he forces that, and I have to agree with him. We have students in here, and this is about environmental justice. We are sitting on ground here that is contaminated. Our community here has fought off a cement plant recently this year that many of these students may not even be aware of, that was put in or trying to be put in a Black community, that we appealed to NAACP to take a position, and they remained quiet until your national office forced the issue for them to release a letter of support. Prior to that, they would not take a position of this cement plant that was literally like 800 or let's say less than 1,000 feet from an elementary school, from elderly homes and things like that. So of course, we're very passionate about this subject of environmental justice, as well as these agencies or these organizations like CJA. We've appealed to them to even help us in this battle, and no return phone calls. When you put on these conferences, you do support immigration and Native American issues, which Blacks have been arm in arm with you. But when it comes to Black issues, they are missing in action, and so has the NAACP. So as a community frontline environmental justice advocate, and we're in here influencing these students to understand what that means, we definitely need to be pushing the envelope. It is not comfortable to be burying our loved ones daily. Our neighbors that are dying, literally. You see us walking around here, if you stopped for a second and actually look at the residents of Vallejo, we look like a community that is impacted by refineries and toxic polluting companies. So my question to you is, as you leave Vallejo, what do you plan on doing when we pick up that phone or send you an email to ask for your support? what will you do from this point on? And I should say also, Toro, what will you do to push the envelope with these students to get them involved in this fight? Because their lives matter as well as ours, but we also know that Black folks is on the front line hitting the brunt in every negative and health effect and environmental impacts. We are at the highest number. So until we also address the impacts on Black folks, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. And we can discuss that without adding every other special interest in there. It doesn't have to be Black and brown. It can be brown alone, Black alone, as we handle these other issues, but we can't run from this Black issue. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, my answer to the question is that I would point you to the local NAACP, because that's what we do. Like, we support the local NAACP, and so we would definitely point you to the local NAACP, and if the NAACP, we would support them in whatever action that they want to take. Like, that's our mission, and that's our protocols, and that's our modus operandi. So.
Support us, then what happens? We appeal to them, and like what happened with the cement plant and other issues, they don't support us, then what does the national office do?
So maybe I would defer to.
It wasn't that we, as individuals, didn't support that fight about the, but we have policies and procedures as local branches.
Yeah.
That we too have to follow, which is directed from national. So when something comes up and it's a issue that we can't respond to without national's approval, the direct action from national, it's not that we're ignoring the issue, because we're just as passionate about the disparities in health and education and everything else when it comes to
I just want to ask a quick
being
question.
Black
Did she
in
contact
America.
you though? Did she contact you when Adonna and them contacted her about the cement? She said they contacted National. You're the EJ, you're the director of EJ, you're the director of environmental justice and all that. Did they contact you about the cement?
I think what you're talking about, though, is that there was a direct action, so it was a legal. You probably kind of contacted the Office of the General Counsel. Is that true? Yeah, I think that's because what it is, and this is where it gets into all those things. But yeah, so when it comes to direct action, because of these liability things and whatever, there's a whole process that they have to go through to get approval to do direct action. So if that's what you're saying, that there was a direct action barrier. So one thing you could do if you were having that kind of, if you wanted to do something and you're finding that you're not getting a response around something that you want to do around environmental climate justice, you can definitely, now we have a ECJ organizer for this area, Quentin King. So you can reach out to him, and he sits there where the Office of the General Counsel is. So he could help to kind of, to help to navigate that. If you're not getting the response, it will allow you to take action on behalf of civil rights for your community. So we can help to navigate that with you. So definitely feel free to CC us, when you're reaching out to the Office of the General Counsel, and we can help out.
I'd like to take a few more questions, and we'll have an opportunity for you all to meet and greet and chat with Ms. Patterson after the session. We're having a reception in Wilderman Hall in the Great Room. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to, the cement plant fight, students at Toro actually did a big research paper. So all the members of the Public Health Club at Toro, Pediatrics Club at Toro, the American College of Osteopathic Family Physicians, the California Health Professional Student Alliance, and in 2016, your clubs organized and wrote great letters opposing the cement plant. So student-led movement, it was really important for our fight that we had in South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I mean, one of the reasons why we started, just to address a comment that you made about Toro's involvement, one of the reasons why we started the social justice and public health is because we did notice the disparities, not here in Vallejo in particular, because we are here, and we are taking a stance. Social justice is part of our mission. It's part of what we're incorporating. It's the reason why we have this now as a required course. It's not an optional, it's not an elective for our students. So our students come in so that they can get some sort of grounding and an opportunity to explore what's going on here in Vallejo, but also throughout the country. And we have, in general, done kind of a topic-specific session each year, but we will start rotating the sessions so the students have more exposure. Many of our students take the course twice. They take it the second year as an elective, and they do write a policy brief. And so if it's something that you'd like to, chat with me about, I can give you my contact information, because we may be able to actually pair our students with you who may be interested to write policy briefs that can actually change some legislation. And so we are very open to those kinds of partnerships and collaborations, and our students are very passionate about helping this community that, for many of them, it's their home, and for some, it's become obviously a second home for them, and they see a lot of the injustices that are here. So thank you.
Just to follow up on that, I wanted to say it's also some of the faculty members, but decidedly not the leadership of this university. We went to them several times to say, will you take a stand on this cement plant and the Vallejo Marine Terminal? They were only concerned about whether or not there would be resumption of the railroad on Mare Island. They weren't willing to take a stand otherwise. This also holds true for the Maritime Academy, the other university in town, where the students and the faculty are the ones that took the leadership, not the administration.
So I want to also bring up the fact that Touro University, California just joined a national network of place-based social racial justice institutions across the United States in order to learn from other faith-based schools and private institutions that do place-based work. We have a new provost who started 18 months ago who is from Vallejo, so very intimately familiar with the history of Vallejo and issues, which I think is important for us right now. It's a time in our history where we can really work with our anchor institutions across Vallejo, Solano County, make sure we are recruiting and retaining students that are going to come into our university and really embrace our social justice mission. So I do think that as we kind of move forward as administration and leadership, that things are starting to kind of change to embrace that we can't be the university on the island anymore, nor should we be. We cannot be the universities on the hill anymore across higher ed institutions. We cannot be within communities, but not be within communities. And so I think it's really important as we do community-based research and partnerships that we are asking our communities as academics what the needs are, doing needs assessments, and really making sure our departments are helping. I cannot speak for Cal Maritime specifically. I do know their leadership there, but I know they're on several boards with us. And seem to be at least wanting to come to the table as an anchor institution in Vallejo. So I see a shift. You have different types of leaders coming in. I know I'm very social justice based. I have a very different background from a lot of administrators, being a political activist and community organizer. But my husband and I we live in South Vallejo, and so we are very vested both personally and professionally to this community. So I'm hoping that maybe, we can all continue to work together as anchor institutions to impact change for those that are most underserved in this community. So.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned that there was a landfill where the sealant leaked and the African American community was not notified. That was extremely shocking to me, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate more on why did they defend themselves in any way, and what was done about that?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any particular explicit defense because, yeah, it was interesting. I mean, because the African American community lived on one side of the landfill. It was literally, like I've stood in their backyard and the landfill is literally right there. And then the white community, was also in proximity, so there was no difference in terms of where they lived or anything. But the records, like there were the county records that clearly showed the letters going out. They had the copies of all the letters, and so this is why they won the settlement, because it was so clear cut that these letters went out, and and they drank that water with the trichloroethylene, which is a known carcinogen, for years. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund really, went after that case and represented the families and so there was no particular like, oh, well, we tried to send the letters, or we thought that this community wouldn't be impacted. Like there was no particular defense per se, and that's why the culpability was just so, it was undeniable. Yeah, it's staggering. Like you said, I was also, even knowing how virulent environmental racism is, even I was like, good grief, So, yeah. That's but if you ever want to look it up, it's the Holt family, Holt, and it's in Dixon, Tennessee. If you wanted to, there's a lot written on it.
My turn. Hello, thanks so much for being here. Thanks to our community partners for bringing up the cement factory. As one of the students who helped co-author that letter, I really appreciate you guys continuing to speak truth to power on that issue. And I think we really just kind of avoided throwing salt in the wounds of the environmental injustice in this area by not building that cement factory here. So lots of more work to be done on that front with student organizing on campus and off campus. And so, Ms. Patterson, thank you for being here. I do have a question for you. According to the Commonwealth Fund, our $3.3 trillion healthcare system spews about 10% of the carbon dioxide generated by the United States each year. If you were to make recommendations to future healthcare workers on where we should focus our organizing to mitigate that and avoid a climate catastrophe, what would you focus on?
Yeah. So this is one of the things, this is why what the Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector initiative is so critical to this work. So one is just like the actual buildings and making sure that those buildings are more sustainable, more energy efficient, and so forth and so on. So that's one thing. Two is the manufacturing of goods, and also there's such an excessive amount of waste in the health industry. I mean, in the hospital systems in particular. So really having some better standards around buildings, around waste, and around even manufacturing processes and products are the foci that we've been working on, and that it would be great we're a part of the American Public Health Association, and there's a whole kind of working group within the American Health Association around emissions reduction around the healthcare industry, and those are some of the recommendations that are coming out of that, but I definitely recommend connecting with that working group as well, the Environmental Health Working Group and that subgroup. So that's what I would say. Thank you for asking. That's a very good and nuanced question. It's been a miracle that I knew the answer, but it's only because I come out of public health that I happen to know. But most people, yeah.
So in response to your question, Healthcare Without Harm and their Practice Green Health program are probably the strongest advocates for reducing healthcare greenhouse gas emissions and creating sustainability, and they have tremendous resources online.
Yeah, and they're definitely a lot more, I don't know, than APHA. Like, because one thing about APHA is that even though, yeah, it's a great in terms of like the potential power and so forth, but it's more potential, whereas Healthcare Without Harm, in terms of their actual recommendations, they're a lot more kind of progressive and aggressive around the types of real radical changes we need to make. So thank you for that.
Any other questions? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
for taking-
Thank you.